Thank you all for your time this evening. I guess good things come to those who wait. This has been a very long process with the town and with the planning board and going through a master plan. And we're at the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of a zoning update. And I do believe that this is definitely the light. So we have a presentation to give you tonight. You've been provided in your packets last week, and we have an update document that was distributed just this evening with some revisions to that document. So what I wanted to do is sort of walk you and the public through what's in there, what kind of led us to this process. So we're going to do a recap, talk through the recent revisions. When I say recent, I mean since last September, and then go through some of the next steps. So we started with this because really we had this very considerable effort around the 2014 master plan. We heard from, it seemed like everybody in Morristown plus some. And one of the things that came out of it is the zoning code was not capable of producing the type of results that the town wants to see when it comes to new development and when it comes to sort of emerging land uses. And so what we ultimately did was we looked and examined literally a parcel by parcel analysis, almost every property in town to confirm that it was in the right district, confirm those boundaries were correct. We looked through the permitted land uses. We looked through codes from communities all across the country to look at what sort of the trends were. This code hasn't been significantly updated since 2007, but the bones of this code are much, much older. And it has served the town well till now, but it is time to modernize it, and that's what this code will do. Some of the other things that we did was, this is a legislative process, but ultimately it's implemented by the planning board, by the zoning officer, by the zoning board. So we created, it really is from soup to nuts, both the substance of that code and making sure that when it came down to it, that the municipal staff was in a good position to implement it, and that people in the public, the current application packet is about 80 pages long, believe it or not. So the current, so this really streamlines the application process, which is one of the main goals of this. So, what did we do? Where did we start? What did we look at? We looked at every variance that has been granted over the last, I'd say, 10 years. We did maps of those variances. We looked for commonalities. We looked for themes. We looked for patterns among those variances. Because if your zoning board is basically granting relief from the ordinance on an everyday basis, that basically becomes the zoning. So what were those things? We looked at best practices. Our code, Morristown's future code, is basically the Cincinnati code, the format of it, at least, and the way that it's structured. So thank you, Cincinnati, for leading the way in that. And we literally looked at, in every district, we looked at the biggest parcel, and we looked at the smallest parcel. And we had a draftsperson lay out those sites, because we didn't want unintended consequences. And we wanted to know how these buildings would lay out, these different zoning patterns, and that's what we did to refine and to come to these 10-foot side yard, 30% coverage. They actually do have a meaning, and they were tested and verified. So this code is broken down. It's different than the current code, the way it's organized, different than basically most codes I've seen, at least in New Jersey. That it uses 3 different ways to sort of triangulate the right zoning solution for a piece of property. One is its location, in what neighborhood or in what district is it. 2 is what type of building is being built, and this is where that idea of what people hear about form-based code, that there's certain types of buildings in Morristown. It's pretty amazing if you really boil it down. There's like 10 different types. And they're just repeated in different places, in different ways, in different varieties. But what is the essence of those building types, and what makes them great, and what makes the ones that we don't love not great, and how do we avoid that? So that's what the building types were about. And then finally, the frontage types is that in these districts, the example that we use is South Street and Pine Street. That on South Street, it's all the same district, all the way down to Dumont Place. But Pine Street is a very different kind of identity than South Street. South Street is this busy, active street. Pine Street kind of calms down a little bit. So we were able to add another dimension of this ordinance, because typically it was like this blunt instrument. If you're in the same district, you get treated the same way. But now, if you're on that side street, you get treated a little bit differently than you would on that main street. And that main street can handle more. It's appropriate to have sometimes more intensive uses or retail or things like that you might not want on a side street. But rather than cut the town up into 22 little zones like it is now, we were able to use these different factors and dimensions to create that. What hasn't changed? We didn't mess with any of these things. Basically, I'm not going to waste time reading through them, but all the things that are basically proven engineering controls, things that have worked for the town that we've had no problems with, we just basically reorganized the code. So I wanted this, I don't expect anybody ever to read this thing cover to cover, but I wanted there to at least be a way that as you're leafing through it, that there's an order to the code. And a lot of these things kind of were stuck in there over the years. And so we grouped all those things together, which don't get looked at by residents, that don't get seen every day. So again, the things that we wanted to accomplish here was we wanted to simplify the ordinance, we wanted to make it more predictable, we wanted to preserve the town's character, spur reinvestment where it's appropriate, and ensure that the design of the buildings that we get moving ahead are the best we can. So we basically boiled down, I forgot the exact number, but something like 20 districts. This is the residential districts. These are the commercial districts into, at least in half. I don't know the exact number. A handful. So, but we really restricted because there's an OB1, OB2, CBD1, CBD2. So basically what we did was we created districts that made sense, and that the people that are from here and that understand the geography of this town, the boundaries will make sense to you, and you will understand why a certain neighborhood or a certain district stops where it does, and that why a certain area sort of has an overlay on top of that district. So we wanted to make it as intuitive as possible. We wanted to preserve the character. As much as I'm sitting here talking about this as a significant change, a lot of that has to do with the framework and the organization, but to single-family districts, and what we heard loud and clear, the first goal of the first objective in that 2014 master plan is preserve the identity and the integrity of single-family neighborhoods. There's 4% of single-family neighborhoods have had a change in their zoning classification, and that typically is because something happened before this that the code needed to catch up, the map needed to catch up because there was a zoning variance granted or something happened. But we did not decide on our own or with the planning board or with anybody that residential neighborhoods should be changed from what they are. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So these single-family, like I said, reflect existing conditions. Almost 84% of the properties in general, the use that they are today is the use that they will be tomorrow, or after this is ultimately adopted. Again, and a lot of the things that where there were changes was to reflect a condition, or to hone in on a very specific objective where there's a certain vision, in an area where, to use an example, in the master plan, people in Morristown said, we love having the ability to walk out and go get milk in our neighborhood. That makes Morristown unique. It's not a typical suburban town. I have a suburban life, but I can also walk and get candy or milk or newspapers or whatever. So we created, where that exists, we created neighborhoods, commercial zones. Those were residential zones. All of those milk shops where you could get milk from were non-conforming uses. And so what we did was we basically said, it's okay that you're here. We want you to be here. You add to these residential neighborhoods. And so that's where a lot of those changes in uses come from. Most of the zones where it is a 3-story maximum height, it is preserved. The permitted densities in this revised code are based largely upon existing zones. I will tell you, for the most part, the zoning or the densities have been decreased from what they are in the current code. and that we've also closed some density loopholes. In the CBD2, arguments have been brought to us about the way that density should be applied there, and that the headquarters plaza basically allowed residential zoning without any controls. It was, probably an oversight years ago. Nobody ever did anything about it, but we were able to close and clean up some of those loopholes. One of the things that reinvesting in residential neighborhoods, when you're looking to buy a new home or if you're living in an existing home and you're like, do I add that kitchen? Do I add that air conditioning, next zone of air conditioning or whatever? And you go to the zoning office, they're like, yeah, no, sorry. But you're going to go to the zoning board. You're like, maybe I will sell my house rather than do that. And that's happened. And I've heard that happen. I've heard that people moved out of town because they would rather, go find another place rather than go through this expensive, unpredictable process. So what we did in residential neighborhoods was say that, rather than try to do averaging and find out a specific yard, a 5-foot yard or a 10-foot yard, we basically realized that there's 6 types of parcels in Morristown in terms of width, and that the yards should be proportional to those widths. And that's how residential neighborhoods in the United States, or at least in this area, are pretty much established. And that's how the pattern's established. So, and it doesn't say that this house is non-conforming and that house is conforming and that one's non-conforming. It allows them to be conforming today within certain limits, and it allows you to go to the zoning officer and pull a permit to do most minor things that don't involve actual variances into those yards. But it creates a much more flexible standard based on the existing lot widths. One of the things that people might find hard to believe is that residential apartments over retail are not permitted in Morristown, to this day. In 2003 they recommended it, in 2007 they recommended it, in 2014 they recommended it. Today, we're doing it. And we've found what we think is the appropriate ways and controls of doing that. It's been all done through variances. It's been all done through variances and redevelopment to date. So this creates that opportunity. And what the prohibition on this did was it meant that only the biggest projects, the ones that could sustain a large and expensive legal process, those were the only ones that advanced. But the small scale ones were mom and pop kind of thing where they might want to take what was an office for years and turn it into 2 apartments. They have to go to get a zoning variance now. That's another thousands of dollars. They don't do it. Some of these things sit empty. You'd be surprised. So this creates the ability for that. It increases the predictability, and it creates a new structure for shared parking. Shared parking is something that parking. That's all we talk about in zoning, it seems. Where is everybody going to park? And right now, you're not allowed to make a deal with your next door neighbor to park there at night because that's an office building, and I have residential. So what it does is it creates very specific rules around that, and it allows that to the planning board to permit that without requiring a variance, as long as you're within a certain framework. That's a good thing. And it requires us to not build parking that's going to sit empty all day, or parking that's going to sit empty all night, and nobody likes looking at that, and it's not good for the environment or anybody. So in the design, Morristown's had design standards for 20 or more years. What we did was we took those and put them into codification. They're based largely on the values and the ethos that underlie our existing design standards. They will ensure compatibility. This is really where that form-based thing comes in. It protects the character of what people say when something looks Morristown or looks like Morristown or something. It doesn't say it has to be Victorian or it has to be this. It says that you have to have a certain amount of, you can't have no windows. You have to have a certain amount of windows. You have to have a door. The door has to face the street. This wasn't an overreach like it is in other cases. And so this was the process that we went through. Only a few more slides, but just for the record, with the planning board, we went through 8 presentations. Town council, we went through 2 presentations. We had a master plan adopted late last month on May 31st. Informal presentations to the Board of Adjustment, Parking Authority, Partnership, Historic Preservation, and these things all occurred after you had your presentation. We didn't want to go start sharing this with others before the council had an initial presentation on September 19th, 2017. So these things are the changes that have happened based on all that feedback. And just so that the public is aware, and so you're aware, because that was really the last draft that was circulated. So I kind of break these up into map amendments and text amendments. The map amendments, the Morristown Green, there was one property that was left off after the church on South Park Place, which is where the Anthony's Pizza is. So we just brought that out to the corner. The historic residential overlay was extended to the Washington headquarters neighborhood. That was largely a concern raised by the councilman from that ward, that the historic district in the 4th ward was sort of receiving these protections, but those homes in Washington's headquarters are very, very similar type of situation, need similar type of protections. So, and we agree. So one of the things that you'll see is that we had a 6-story zoning since 2007 in Morristown. The 6-story zoning was recommended in the 2014 master plan. And then, based on a lot of feedback, there has been, and even in board hearings and stuff, concern over building height generally throughout the downtown. There was concern in 2007 when they zoned the whole town to 6 stories. So what we did for the most part was bring it down to 5 stories as a maximum. There's one place across from Headquarters Plaza where we retained that 6-story building height, and it was largely because that seemed to be the most appropriate area to do so, because it would have allowed that type of investment to occur. There's already an existing scale and character of sort of corporate type buildings there, and it's built into a hill. So that, for those reasons, it seemed to us to be the most appropriate place, that if we're going to have taller buildings, that you do it on a state highway, you do it where the front to the back of the lot is about 30-foot difference, and the buildings across the street from you are literally 14 stories tall. So that's what that one was about. We retained the hospital zoning along Mount Kindle Avenue. At one point, it was suggested to be residential. We maintained the existing residential designation. Right now it's 1 and 2 family at the corner of Sussex and Columba. There was a suggestion that it be moved into a commercial district, because at one time it looked like maybe it was commercially used. Now it is not, so we maintain what exists there today. Generally, this is a total inside baseball thing, but there was conditional uses used very heavily in the last draft. We decided that creates some legal risks for us and streamlined it from that perspective. The max height in most areas is 5 stories, where in most areas today, not most, but probably half the downtown is 6 stories. And then added flexibility for small lot infill development in the downtown. We removed residential in Headquarters Plaza as a permitted use. And then along Madison Avenue, we tried to get creative with those office buildings and realized that probably no good deed would go unpunished. We had allowed restaurants and things like that, trying to think that maybe that area would change and become more pedestrian oriented. I don't think that the zoning code is the place to start with that. The master plan re-exam talks about working with the hospital and the property owners there to kind of come up with a vision. Then we'll do a code maybe in the future. So then in 2018, last week basically, or the 31st of May, the planning board adopted a master plan re-examination that basically recommends all the things that I'm here tonight suggesting, and all the things that are in that code. We wanted to make sure that you felt comfortable that your planning board was on the same page before we were going into this, and so they've given their vote and their recommendation in adopting that re-examination. And then it formalizes the land use policies and reflects the work that we've done so far. So this is my last slide. The next steps would be, if you chose to tonight, you could introduce this ordinance on a quote unquote first reading. We'd go back to the planning board, and they would provide you commentary with regard to consistency with the master plan, and then we would move into a public hearing. after that, which, is your last step in the process. So it's been a lot of years. It's good to have gotten this point under our belts. So I'm here to answer any questions you might have prior to introduction. And if not, I will see you at the public hearing.
Great, thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Any comments from council members?
Oh, I'm sorry, I have one more thing. So there's a paper that was handed out to you that provides some of the things that were comments that were received over the past few days. I have them there. I don't know if you want it. Only you. Well, this would only mean something to the council members. It's not going to mean anything to the public because you were provided with a pre-introduction draft. This is the changes to that draft. So they're here. If you have any questions about them, I don't know if you want me to spend your time reading through them. Your question.
And the latest version of the draft was emailed to Margot. Originally it was emailed to me and it kept crashing out, so I wanted to get another version, so we will be getting that directly from the comments.
If we can get a red line version,
Yes.
Electronically at least,
Yes.
and then at least for myself, I've asked the clerk to print out a paper copy, one sheet per page, double-sided, so that we can look at everything.
Sure. So the red line from 2017, from
Yeah, I think that most of it, most of the upfront stuff is all new. So for my purposes, I think it would just be a red line of
the last public.
the design standards.
Okay. We'll run it from based on what was posted on the website, almost a year ago.
No, and Phil, thank you for your patience. I've had a million questions on this thing. It's been quite an education also. But I also have more questions. So, like signage, we didn't talk about signs. We really addressed a lot of the big issues with us. But I do appreciate the fact that, between now and then we can just contact you with any questions or concerns.
At your service.
I know.
So the understanding is that if we introduce the ordinance tonight, more changes can be done as we have some today here. Because one thing is to see a general overview, but another thing is to see small details, that the one that I pointed out to you. Because today we see the impact of past decisions on people's lives. And small detail could mean a lot for families, for business owners, and so on.
I totally agree, and you bring up a good point about process. So what would happen if you were to introduce it this evening and we talk through, and let's just say that all the questions get answered and everybody's comfortable with what you introduced. We would just move on the process that I just described. If something happened and we all sort of agreed that the best thing to do would be to make it a revision, and that revision was considered by the attorneys to be substantial or material in nature, you would reintroduce it again. Just so it kind of starts that process over. But the point is that there is a possibility that we're good. There is a possibility that as you continue to read and test it and look for those impacts on families, and I totally agree with you that the gravity of this change in this town. So this sort of just kicks off the process. So you're not making any final decisions tonight. It just sort of kicks off the process. It allows the planning board to get involved. It allows me to release this document to the public, which is something that I want to do. And that's it.
And I thank you also for time, Chris. Thank you for spending the time today with me and explaining a few things. You're welcome.
Any other comments from council members?
Objections on. Maybe not.
ordinance number 17-2018, an ordinance amending and supplementing chapter 30, land use regulations. Do I have a motion?
Second.
Roll call, Councilman Armington?
Yes.
Councilwoman Davis?
Yes.
Councilman Helms?
Yes.
Councilman Iannico?
Yes.
Councilman Silva?
Yes.
And Council President Foster.
Yes.
Ordinance 17-2018 has been properly introduced. It will be referred to the planning board for their consideration during their June 21st meeting. It is our intention, if all goes well, the public hearing and adoption, if deemed appropriate, will be at the June 26th meeting.
And that's a special meeting on the 21st of the planning board.
It's a special meeting. Thank you. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Morristown.